Alright, hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to look at colonial independence and take a look at some of these different ideas we're going to talk about. So our objectives and standards: to analyze how British colonies were able to gain independence and explain the struggles of the Irish for independent rule. And take a look at the standards too. Okay, vocabulary preview. We have Dominion, Aborigines, Penal Colony, and Home Rule. So once you think about this, and after you see this question, you can pause the lesson, and if you would answer the question, that'd be great. But how can colonies gain independence from another country? So we've talked about this a little bit with the United States and other colonial issues, like with Haiti and the French. So how can, or what are some ideas that colonies can gain independence from other countries? And our essential question: how did British colonies gain independence? Okay, so the British took control of Canada after they defeated the French in the French and Indian War in 1763. Now, some French remained in Canada, mostly in the lower section of the country. Despite this, conflicts between the English and the French in Canada created a demand for representation in Parliament. So Parliament came up with the idea to divide the country in two. Upper Canada remained mostly English, while Lower Canada remained mostly French. But there were still many conflicts that remained that were going to kind of come into play into the 1800s. So the Durham Report. So by the 1830s, resentment in Canada, in Upper Canada and Lower Canada, had led to protest and rebellion in both of them. So Parliament sent a reform-minded man by the name of Lord Durham to investigate the issue. And he recommended that the two separate colonies should be united into the province of Canada, and he also believed that they could govern themselves. So by the middle of the 1800s, many believed that Canada should have a central government. In 1867, Canada formed the Dominion of Canada, and it also included Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So finally, as a Dominion, Canada could rule on its own issues and affairs domestically, but remain part of the British Empire. So it's still part of the British Empire and follows the Queen and things like that, but it can rule on its own domestic issues and affairs by itself. So let's talk about Australia and New Zealand. So British sea captain James Cook claimed New Zealand in 1769 and part of Australia in 1770. Now, he thought no one lived on the island of Australia until he came into contact with the Aborigines, or the native people. And there's a picture of a gentleman there who is an Aborigine, and you may have heard that term before. In 1788, Great Britain began using Australia as a penal colony. Now, what a penal colony is, or was, is it is a place where convicted criminals were sent to serve their sentence. In England, they used this because the prisons were overcrowded, so they began to send prisoners and convicted criminals to Australia to finish out their time that they needed to serve. Once they finished serving their prison time, the convicts could purchase land and live there. Australia wasn't just a place for convicts and former convicts. More immigrants began to arrive in Australia and began practicing sheep herding as well. In New Zealand, it was a little different. Immigration was a little slower. The first people to arrive there were missionary groups, or people who were with a church group who were trying to adapt the native people to their religion. Okay, between 1839 and 1840, New Zealand became part of the British Empire as well. However, just like in Canada, these colonists in Australia and New Zealand are going to look for independence as well. So both colonies wanted to remain part of the British Empire and have self-rule, or make some of their own decisions. So by the 1850s, Australia and New Zealand created their own governments and were, making decisions in their countries. And by the early 1900s, both colonies became dominions of the British Empire as well. Remember, with Canada, we talked about dominions. So Australia and New Zealand, they're also dominions that, can rule on their domestic issues and domestic policies, but are still part of the British Empire. And just one side note here, however, with that said, Just like with America and Native Americans in our relationship with Native Americans, there were tensions, and I believe there are still some tensions between Native peoples in New Zealand and Australia today, too. All right, let's talk about the Irish. So England had had some type of rule or something to do with Ireland since the 1100s. And because of this, many Irish disliked the English and their rule. They felt the English, take advantage of them and do things that aren't so nice. And especially in the 1840s, the Irish struggled with what something was called known as the Irish potato famine. There was the Irish like to eat a lot of potatoes, and if you are part Irish, you probably know that potatoes are a big part of almost every meal. I know with my family, we're part Irish, and we have potatoes with every meal or things like that, and like to eat potatoes. But either way, in the 1840s, this potato famine caused a shortage of potatoes, and a lot of Irish starved because of this. And they were starving because of this, and the British kind of still wanted the Irish to pay their rent. And the Irish felt it was unfair, like, hey, we're starving and we need to buy food, but you're making us pay high prices for rent and food still. So again, a lot of dislike from the Irish for the English because of different things that went on in this very, very long history of rule. In the late 1800s, the Irish also looked to kind of, break away from Great Britain. Some wanted independence altogether from Great Britain. Others wanted what was known as Home Rule, which is just local control over internal issues only. However, the British are going to refuse both ideas, so no independence, no Home Rule, and Ireland is still part of Great Britain today to a degree. But either way, this will lead to violence and rebellion by the Irish against the British in later years, and we'll maybe talk about that a little bit later on. Okay, just to kind of wrap it up here a little bit. So remember that Canada was taken over by the British after the French and Indian War. It was divided into two separate countries at one point, into Upper Canada and Lower Canada. It's finally united and becomes part of a dominion of Great Britain. With Australia, it was founded as a penal colony, so for for convicts and prisoners to serve out their time, and eventually that will grow and will spread with immigration, and also with New Zealand. So New Zealand and Australia will also be given representation rights and become dominions as well. And with the Irish, it's a little more difficult. They struggled for independence, and Great Britain really doesn't want to let go of control of them. And this is going to cause more problems for the English and the Irish and the British, excuse me, later on down the road as violence takes hold. Okay, that's all I have for today. So if you would make sure that you answer the questions and submit them, I'd appreciate it. And I will see and talk to you later.